Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our cruise, welcome to the symphony, and welcome to you all personally. Some of you I have known for a while, some of you I've known for a very long time. And it's always a pleasure to see old friends, and hopefully we're going to have some new friends as well, because certainly some of you are new. And at the risk of boring, perhaps, some of you who have heard this story before, I have to tell it because it sums up so very well what we try to do here. We're going to tell you about the places we're going to see. We're going to give you an understanding of some of the events, some of the people who helped shape these places. I'm going to tell you the who, what, when, where, how of what happened. That's fairly easy to know. But I also try to give you an understanding of the why. Why is always the hard question. Why did they do what they did? What was in the minds of the people? That's the hardest thing to know, what's in the mind of someone else. I knew that and my wife knew that, but something that happened to us a few years ago greatly strengthened our understanding. My wife had a grandfather who lived to be 100. We visited him regularly right up to the end, and he was sharp right up to the end. He lived in what once had been a hotel on Coney Island in New York, now an old age residence. And on one of the visits, Carol said to him, "Grandpa, is there anything we can do for you? Can we take you anywhere? Can we buy you anything?" And he said, "Yes." He said, "You can take me up to the boulevard to the hat store. I need to buy a new hat. I got my last one there." "Of course, Grandpa." And then Carol came to me. She said, "You know, Grandpa doesn't get out very much anymore. He doesn't have a lot of money. I'm afraid he doesn't realize what's happened to prices. I think perhaps he's going to be embarrassed." "Don't worry," I said, "I'll take care of it." We got to the hat shop. I took the salesman aside. "Whatever hat the gentleman picks, tell him it's $10. I'll make up the rest." Grandpa tried on some hats, picked out one he liked. The salesman said, "That's $10. Grandpa paid him, and then the salesman came to me privately. "Sir, that's a $60 hat." I gave the salesman the other $50, and we left. And we were walking down the street, and Carol looked over at him, and she said, "Grandpa, that new hat of yours looks wonderful." "Yes," he said, "and it's such a bargain. The last one I got there cost me $60. You don't know what's in the other person's mind. We are talking about Mexico. We are talking about the Spanish conquest of Mexico. And when we tell stories in history, we have to find a place to start, because nothing in history stands by itself. There are no stories in history with beginnings and end. Everything's related to everything else. We're going to start here with a place that the Maya called Anahuac, the great valley of Mexico. It means the navel. It means the heart of the world, and it was for them. Civilization began there a very long time ago, as far back as 1500 BC. The Olmec were already civilized. They left very little behind. It's a mystery to us largely, just some great carved stone heads. But about 200 AD, the Maya began their great civilization, and Maya had a remarkable level of civilization. They built magnificent cities. Their great capital was Teotihuacan, huge pyramids, 3-story high stone houses, beautifully painted. The Maya had a great understanding of art and astronomy and architecture. They made charts of lunar motions and charts of planetary movement that are the most accurate charts ever devised by a non-industrialized people. They had a calendar which was more accurate than our calendar today. They were very adept mathematicians. They invented the use of the zero 1,000 years before Europe figured it out. Their civilization was well advanced, remarkably sophisticated, but they did have one curious relationship with the universe. They recognized the existence of certain cycles in the universe which represented to them great fear. They knew, for example, that every day the sun rose out of the earth and then later disappeared back and it became dark. And they realized if the sun doesn't return, all life ends. They didn't know where the sun went. They had some understanding of astronomy, but not of the movement of the earth. So if the sun didn't come back, life would end. They saw that every year there was a rainy season, and then the rains ended, and it turned dry. If the rains didn't come back, life would end. But the most important cycle of all to them was a 52-year cycle. They had two calendars. The great celestial calendar of 365 and a quarter days, but they also had a religious calendar, 13 20-day months, 260 days, and they numbered every day from both calendars. So every day had 2 dates. And it took 52 years to go through all the possible combinations from those two calendars, complete this cycle. And it was their belief that once that cycle was completed, the universe would end, unless they could contrive to keep it going. And they did that by bribing the gods. They bribed the gods to make the sun return. They bribed the gods to make the rains return. And most importantly, they bribed their great god, Quetzalcoatl, to let the world continue at the end of each 52-year cycle. And in making these bribes, the one thing they realized was that the value of the things they were bribing for would determine the value of the currency they used in the bribe. The most valuable thing they bribed for, of course, was the continued existence of the universe, and the most valuable currency they could use was human blood, which they did. And so they sacrificed. They sacrificed to the gods, to their great god Quetzalcoatl, among others. And there's a very curious thing about Quetzalcoatl. They represented Quetzalcoatl, as we see here, as we saw in the first image, as a great feathered serpent. That's how they carved Quetzalcoatl on all their buildings, on all their monuments. But that's not what Quetzalcoatl looked like. They knew what Quetzalcoatl looked like. And it's really fascinating because Quetzalcoatl had visited them at a time in the far distant, forgotten past when he taught them civilization. And they said Quetzalcoatl was a man. He was a man who had fair skin and blue eyes and blonde hair and a curly beard. Now, these people had never seen blonde hair or blue eyes or beards. That didn't exist in their world. But that's how they described Quetzalcoatl. And they said Quetzalcoatl had come to them out of the sea from the east. And he had created the world for them. And then he had left back into the sea, saying to them he would return one day at the end of one of the 52-year cycles. And when he came back, the world would end. How do they describe Quetzalcoatl in a way they had never seen before? What's really intriguing is that the great Inca god, Contiki Viracocha, is exactly the same description. Fair, blonde, curly beard. The Inca in South America had never seen those things either. And yet there they are in their descriptions. About 1250 AD, the Maya civilization had reached its peak earlier, but was still in existence. A new people came into Anahuac. They came from the north. We don't know where. We've tried to locate it, but we can't. And they called themselves the Mexica. But the word very rapidly became used among them and then among us. We call them the Aztec. They were a fierce, warlike, belligerent people. And they had their own version of their creation. Their god was an avatar of Quetzalcoatl, Quetzalcoatl in a different form, who they called Huitzilopochtli. The word means the hummingbird of the left hand. But they told all directions as if they were facing the setting sun. So the left hand meant the south. Huitzilopochtli was the hummingbird of the south. And they believed he had said to them, I want you to wander south until you see a sign. And when you see this sign, that's where you will settle. And the sign is this. In a lake, there will be a little islet. And on that tiny island will be a rock. And growing from the rock will be a cactus. And in the cactus will be a snake. And an eagle will be killing the snake. And they saw that in Lake Texcoco, a wide, shallow, marshy lake at the center of Anahuac. And that symbol, the eagle killing the snake, is today the seal of Mexico. It is the symbol that the Aztec followed until they settled in Anahuac. And when I say settled, what they did was they proceeded to make war on all of the tribes, all of the civilizations and cities surrounding Lake Texcoco. And one by one they conquered them with great ferocity. And when they conquered them, they let those kings stay in charge of their kingdoms, but as vassals, as puppets. Because their capital city, the Aztecs would build, starting in the year 1330, in the center of Lake Texcoco. They sank barges full of stones, they built foundations, and then they created this great city that they named Tenochtitlan. 300,000 people, also, all stone, magnificent architecture, all of it copied from the Maya. They just swallowed the Mayan culture whole, sort of like what the Romans did with the Greeks. They didn't create anything new, they just took what was already there and made it theirs. Just 3 causeways connect Tenochtitlan with the shore. And those causeways, each of them, are cut by a series of openings bridged by drawbridges. When those drawbridges are raised, Tenochtitlan is impregnable. It is a fortress. But in order to survive, everything they need, all their food, all their supplies, everything must be brought to them. And that was the job of these vassal states that the Aztecs had conquered. They had to pay tribute to the Aztecs every month, and that tribute, among other things, were all the supplies they needed to stay alive. And they paid because they knew that any individual who didn't pay tribute would suffer a terrible retribution at the hands of their conquerors, at the hands of the Aztecs. And so Tenochtitlan thrived, and the vassal states were allowed to live relatively independently as long as they obeyed their masters. The Aztecs adopted all of Mayan culture. One of the things they adopted was an intriguing game, we think it was a game, called the ball game. At their great ruins, this is the part of the ruin of Chichen Itza, ball courts were built. This is the largest ball court of all, 290 feet long, 100 feet wide, and those walls were about 25 feet high, all stone. And it was a game that they played with rubber balls. Rubber grew wild. They didn't refine it very much, but they made the latex into balls. These are the world's first rubber balls. And as far as we understand it, those rings high up on the wall were the center of the game. The players had to bounce the balls off their hips, and if you managed to bounce the ball through the ring, you won the game. The meaning of the game, we have to make up. We're not sure. We believe that the losing teams frequently were sacrificed, their heads mounted on poles, so obviously it was of great importance. But the Aztecs took what the Mayans had done and expanded it, especially their fear of retribution, their need to sacrifice. Where the Maya would sacrifice hundreds of people during their great celebrations, the Aztecs went way beyond that, because they were driven by an internal fear. They knew that they ruled all of Anahuac by force. They had taken it all by force of arms. They had, in other words, usurped the power to rule. And they feared that at one of the 52-year cycle ends, Quetzalcoatl would come back and it would make them pay retribution for this crime, specifically ending the world to punish them. And so they sacrificed to Quetzalcoatl in an enormous size. At the end of a 52-year cycle, it was common for there to be 50,000 captives lined up waiting to be sacrificed. Now, not everybody that was sacrificed was a captive. You could volunteer to be sacrificed. Sometimes people who were very old, people who were sick, people who, in other words, were willing to die, were happy to undergo what they called the flower death. But most of the captives were prisoners of war. And of course, after the Aztecs had been in power for a while, there were no more wars. They had conquered everybody. And what they did was to contrive something they called the flower wars. These were phony wars. The Aztec rulers would negotiate or order one of their vassal kings, we're going to have a war with you on this date in this place, and the only purpose of the war was to produce prisoners to be sacrificed. And the means of sacrifice was terrible. The temples to the great gods, especially to Quetzalcoatl, were high atop these great pyramids that stood in the centers of the city, pyramids that were some 300 feet high. They dominated the skyline. And the temples were on the very top. And the prisoners would be lined up, and they would mount those stairs, and at the very top were the great sacrificial altars. And each prisoner in turn would arrive at the altar, and there would be a priest waiting and a group of helpers. And the priest would be carrying an obsidian knife. Obsidian is volcanic glass. So these knives were razor sharp. And each sacrificial subject in turn would be laid on his back on the altar, both hands and both feet held by helpers. And the priest would take that knife, split open his chest, cut out his heart, still beating, and hold it up for everyone to see. And then the body would be pushed down the stairs to tumble down and join the growing pile at the bottom, and the next person step up in line. When they were sacrificing 50,000 people, the sacrifice might go on for 4 days, unbroken. They lived in terror that sooner or later they were going to have to pay for their crime of stealing the right to rule this paradise of Anahuac. In 1504, a new emperor was crowned. He was Montezuma, actually they said Moctezuma II. Young man, apparently bright, a very pleasant young man actually. The Aztec Empire was at its absolute pinnacle of power. And he ruled well, but the year 1519 marked the end of one of the 52-year cycles. And as that year began, terrible portents were seen. Fire, comets raced across the sky, strange lights were seen at night, the voice of a woman was heard crying out for her lost children. But this was ordinary, this happened every time. These things were always reported. But then there was something new, something that had never happened before. Couriers came to Moctezuma to report, Quetzalcoatl has landed on our shoreline in the east. Quetzalcoatl was Hernan Cortez. Cortez was born in the year 1485 in Extremadura in Spain. He was a hidalgo, an untitled nobleman, a decent family. They trained him to be a notary, but he had better things in mind for himself. When he was just 8 years old, in his hometown of Medellin in Spain, he had seen Christopher Columbus pass through on his way to his great second voyage in 1493. Cortez remembered how Columbus was treated as a great hero. Cortez remembered that this was all because of his discovery of the New World. And so when he got to be 17, in the year 1502, he decided he'd go to the New World. He had thought perhaps of joining a Spanish army in Italy. There was good loot to be had. No, the New World sounded much more romantic and much better. Unfortunately, he missed his ship. And there was a reason. A man by the name of Bernal Diaz wrote of him years later. When Cortez was a young man, he was a little wild about women. A woman, a love affair, if you will, had made him miss his ship. Well, he took a ship in 1504. He landed in Cuba. He fought in the wars to conquer both Cuba and then Hispaniola, the next island from the Indians. By 1511, he was the secretary to the colonial governor, Diego de Velázquez. He married Doña Catalina Velázquez, the governor's daughter-in-law. He got a great estate. Young aristocrats were given these estates as free for their service. And on his estate, he prospered. There was some gold in Cuba, and he gathered the gold, but mostly he prospered from cattle and from slaves. But he and everyone else in Cuba quickly learned there was a greater prize to be had, and not all that far away. Word reached them, rumors, but rumors clearly that were all focused on the same thing. Somewhere off to the west, across the sea, but not terribly far, was this great, vast, wealthy place called Mexico. In February of 1517, a man by the name of Hernandez de Cordova sailed from Cuba with 2 ships to find this fabled land of Mexico. Didn't know where he was going, so he wandered around at sea for 3 weeks, until he finally landed on the shores of what we today call Yucatan. But Yucatan is not a place name. Cordova's men captured a young Mayan and said to him, "What is the name of this place? What is this place?" Of course, they said it in Spanish. And the young man responded to them in Mayan, "I don't understand you." And the Mayan for "I don't understand you" is Yucatan. And so Yucatan is the name. At a little town called Champoton, Cordova's party of men was attacked by a very large war group of Aztec warriors. The Aztecs severely outnumbered the Spanish. About half the Spanish party were killed. Most of the rest were injured, were wounded, including Cordova himself. But he managed to get his men back to the ship. They sailed back to Mexico, back to Cuba, and after a few weeks he died there. But before he did, he told what he had seen, clear signs of wealth. He had found Mexico, and there was riches. Oh yes, there were riches there. And so, in April of 1518, a man by the name of Juan de Grijalva formed an expedition to go back to Mexico. Cordova had brought 2 Mayan boys back with him as prisoners. They were taught Spanish. They became translators. Grijalva would bring them with him as translators, and about 240 armed Spaniards. He sailed in April of 1518. He landed on the Yucatan. He knew where he was going. He was attacked at Champoton, and the Aztecs quickly learned that the Spanish had a weapon that they absolutely could not deal with. Not the horse, not the musket, it was the steel sword. They had to get close, and the Spanish steel swords just cut them down. Grijalva's men killed more than 200 of the attacking Aztecs, only lost 7 men himself. And so he pressed on along the coast, landing and examining, and as he moved north, deeper and deeper into the Aztec Empire, the riches, the obvious signs of wealth, got greater and greater. He finally landed at a place, the mouth of the Rio Jamopa River. And there, a party came down from Tenochtitlan to visit them, a party specifically sent by Moctezuma himself. They met with Grijalva. They offered him a great banquet and many rich gifts. And then, as they were ordered to do, they said to him, "Having all of this, sir, please leave and don't come back." Grijalva had seen what he wanted to see. He left, taking all of those riches with him, went back to Cuba, and everybody saw what was in Mexico for the taking. On October the 23rd, 1518, Hernan Cortez got a contract from Charles V, King of Spain, to organize an expedition to go back and conquer Mexico. He put together a force of 663 men, soldiers and sailors. When the Governor Velasquez, heard how big Cortez's group was in early colonial Cuba, 663 armed Spaniards with a lot of fighting men, Velasquez was very upset. That's more men than he could manage. He ordered Cortez to disband his force, but Cortez conveniently didn't hear the order. On the 15th of April, 1518, he sailed. He landed on the coast of Mexico and proceeded to set up his camp. One of the people that his men early on captured was a young Mayan woman. We speak of her today as a princess. She probably was an aristocrat, very attractive. She quickly learned Spanish. Her name was Melina. She was referred to by the Spaniards as Malintzin, because Tzin was the Aztec way of expressing an aristocratic title. So she was an aristocrat. And she became Cortez's translator. Almost certainly she became his mistress as well. Moctezuma confirmed these reports of what had landed on his shore. This was a god. This was Quetzalcoatl. Moctezuma knew it. And so he instructed his people, do not interfere with these people. Do not attack them or in any way bar their way. Whatever they ask, they get. Perhaps we can somehow mollify this Quetzalcoatl so he doesn't end the universe. And so in July of 1518, Cortez and his men began marching for Tenochtitlan. They arrived in November. They had not been impeded in any way. Montezuma came out to meet them. He was carried by his highest nobles on a golden throne, shaded from the sun by a great canopy of green feathers, all interworked with gold and silver thread. He never touched the ground. He was wearing golden sandals impregnated with precious stones. And he was very courteous, but he felt obliged to give this god whatever he wanted. What the god wanted, of course, was his empire. Cortez and his men marched into Tenochtitlan right into the royal palace. They brought Montezuma with them as their security and made him their prisoner. And for the next 6 months, Cortez in essence ruled. And his number one motivation was gold. He took all the gold that was in the treasury and demanded that Montezuma give more and more and more. And Montezuma did. Anything to make this god happy. Anything so that this god will not destroy our country. So much gold that even the most ordinary soldier in Cortez's army became rich overnight. One of them was given as his prize a solid gold Mayan calendar 6 feet in diameter. He was given the sun, and still they wanted more. Montezuma gave everything Cortez wanted except one thing, because the Spanish always had this in the back of their minds. This is not why they came. They came for gold. But they also felt obliged to convert the heathen. They had priests with them, and they wanted Montezuma and his people to convert to Christianity. And Montezuma would not. That he resisted with absolute force. The harder the Spanish tried, the more he resisted. The Spanish removed the idols from the great temples atop the pyramids. The pyramids were stained with generations of sacrificed blood. They washed them down clean. They placed images of the Virgin Mary where the great idols had stood. Montezuma was not moved. The harder they pressed, the harder these Spanish priests tried to get him to give up his religion, the more resolutely he resisted. And it's an ironic thing, because in fact, it was his religion that was destroying his empire. It was his religion that prevented him from resisting them. But the Spanish priests were driven by their faith. The Maya had developed printing of books, not with printing presses, but in reproducing books that they wrote starting in 400 AD. There was a great Mayan library of books. The Spanish considered all of this to be heresy, and all of the Mayan books were burned. Only 3 books remain today, what we call codexes. One in Manila, one in Dresden, and one in Berlin. All the rest of the Mayan books were lost. Similarly, they felt obliged by their faith to get this conversion, and it never came. The harder they pushed, the more resolutely the Aztecs pushed back. But they would not break Montezuma's rule to attack the Spanish. In May of 1520, word suddenly arrived in Tenochtitlan that a new party of these terrible strangers were on the coast. The original group, when they were first reported to Montezuma, were described as follows. Great floating islands have brought terrible strangers to our shores. These people wear iron casques on their head. Their weapons are iron, their swords are iron, their shields are iron, their bows are iron, their spears are iron. They have great deer that carry them wherever they want to go. They meant horses. They had never seen horses. There were no horses in the Americas. They have dogs whose eyes burn yellow and flash sparks. The Spanish did bring large mastiff dogs with them. They are completely covered, only their faces are visible, but their faces are white, as if made of lime. And their hair is yellow, although some of them have black. And Montezuma knew that that had to be Quetzalcoatl. Now, strangers like this land on the coast again, and Cortez quickly determines this is an expedition sent by Governor Velasquez, commanded by a man by the name of Panfilio de Narvaez, specifically to arrest him and bring him home. He violated the governor's law. There are 600 of them on the coast. Cortez divides his force, takes 300 of his men and a lot of what he'd been given, a lot of the Aztec gold, and he hurries to the coast himself. When he arrives, he immediately lays out all this treasure and shows Narvaez his men. This is what we have, just a small bit of what we have already gotten. It is so rich, they give us anything we want. Narvaez was not a good leader. He was cruel, he was stupid, and he was greedy. His men happily arrested him, joined Cortez. Cortez's party is now 600 men stronger. And as they do, word arrives from Tenochtitlan that something had happened there. When Cortez left Tenochtitlan, he left Pedro de Alvarado in charge. And Alvarado was just what he looks like. Cruel and a typical Spanish aristocrat, at least in our mythology. In May, there's a great holiday celebrating Quetzalcoatl. People packed into the great central square in Tenochtitlan by the thousands to sing, to dance, to celebrate. For whatever reason, Alvarado assembled his men fully armed around the square, sealed all the exits from the square, and then, at an order, waded into the crowd with their swords and cut them down by the thousands. They say that the blood ran ankle deep in the square. The Aztecs were unarmed, they couldn't defend themselves, they just died. And that was finally too much. Finally, the Aztecs said, Montezuma or no Montezuma, we are going to destroy these strangers. And the uprising began. They drove the Spanish into their quarters in the palace where they barricaded themselves in, and there they were trapped. Cortez heard all of this. He assembled his party, 900 men at the coast, and marched back to Tenochtitlan to help his men. And here's where culture comes into this. When the Aztecs fought, no matter who their enemy was, they always fought for two purposes. One, to conquer, of course, but the second, to get captives. They needed captives for sacrifice, and so they fought somewhat, shall we say, cautiously, willing to wait, willing to hold back until their enemies surrendered. Now, the Spanish knew, of course, that if they surrendered or if they didn't, it didn't matter. If they lost, they were dead. So they fought all out. But the Aztecs hampered themselves because they felt, they didn't even feel, they knew that this is the only way to fight. So when Cortez and his men arrived at Tenochtitlan, the Aztecs parted and let them in. Then they closed behind them, drove them into the palace, so now they had all of the Spanish, about 1,500 men and women, barricaded into their quarters in the palace, and they intended to keep them there and starve them out, starve them until they surrendered so they could sacrifice all of them. The resistance was difficult. Spaniards saw their water and their food dwindling. One of the captives they had in the palace was Montezuma's brother, Quetzalcoatl. Cortez told him, I'm going to release you. Go out and talk your people into going home, into giving up this ridiculous rebellion. Quetzalcoatl left. When he got out among his people, he rallied them to attack even more effectively. The fighting got harder, to the point where finally Montezuma himself was sent out onto a terrace of the palace to tell his people to go home. And this is an interesting moment. Montezuma walks out onto the terrace of the palace and is met with a shower of rocks and arrows and killed on the spot by his own angry people. Now that's the story we get in the written Spanish record. It is not the oral history that the Aztecs and Mexicans have told ever since. According to them, Montezuma was secretly murdered by the Spanish when they had no further use for him. We'll never know the story. What we do know is that Montezuma is dead. The Spanish are trapped. Cortez knows he has to somehow contrive a way to get out, or they will all die there. They put together an escape plan. The 30th of June, 1520, is a terribly stormy day. You will hear me use this phrase in other comic applications, perhaps later in the cruise. It was a dark and stormy night, and it was. And Cortez thought that the storm would give them cover. When it reached this height, he said, the Aztecs will not be out in this terrible downpour. They can't see very well. We can perhaps make our getaway. The Spanish had built a special portable bridge that would bridge the openings. They knew that the drawbridges were all open. They had to have some way of crossing the openings in the causeway. They carried this with them. He ordered his men, take as much gold as you want, but remember, we may have to fight. Some of Narvaez's men took all the gold they could carry, which turned out to be a very bad decision. They came out of the palace into the middle of this blinding downpour in the middle of the night. There was no one around. They made their way through the streets, out onto one of the causeways. They had reached the first opening and put their bridge, portable bridge, into the opening when an Aztec sentinel spotted them. He gave the alarm, and Aztecs quickly gathered by the thousands to fight them. The Spanish fought their way across the first opening, and then they found that their portable bridge stuck. They couldn't move it. And so they continued just fighting their way down the causeway without that bridge. Many of Narvaez's men couldn't defend themselves. They were cut down. The gold they were carrying fell into the lake, which is shallow but with a very muddy bottom, and that gold sank out of sight forever. But men and horses and wagons fell into the openings, and the fighting bodies lodged there. The Spanish crossed over the bodies. They fought their way down, and they fought their way all the way to the shoreline. 869 of them did not make it. And about 50 of those were captured, including 5 women. Cortez and the rest of his men made the shore and made safety. But in their full sight, looking back, they could see that their 50 compatriots, including the women, one by one, were sacrificed in full view. And the story goes, Cortez wept. Well, maybe he did, but he was a conquistador. He may have lost the fight, but he wasn't beaten. And the story of the Aztec wealth had reached Cuba and Hispaniola, the developing Spanish colonies, and ships were coming with fresh men and fresh horses and more guns, and steadily his force began increasing. Not only that, but all those vassal states who had been essentially slaves of the Aztecs saw these, whatever they are, strangers, have weapons that can defeat the Aztecs. We can get our freedom. And so by the tens of thousands, they joined Cortez as well. And finally, in August of 1520, he marched on Tenochtitlan again. And what had been an impregnable fortress now became a prison. He surrounded the lake. He cut off all communication. There's an aqueduct that carried water into the city. He destroyed the aqueduct. So now the Aztecs were getting no food and they were getting no water. And a weapon that the Spanish brought, an invisible weapon they didn't know they had, also decimated the Aztecs. This would happen again and again in the New World. The weapon was smallpox. There was no smallpox in America. The locals had never experienced the disease. As deadly as it was to the Europeans, it was deadlier to the Aztecs and the other Native Americans. It swept through them like a ravaging forest fire. It killed them by the tens of thousands. They were starving. They were desperate for water. They were dying of smallpox. And their numbers dwindled and dwindled and dwindled. In the final assault, Cortez and his Indian allies forced their way into the city. The Aztecs, who were still alive, literally fought to the last man. Some 30,000 of his Indian allies died. But they cut the Aztecs down. These are drawings made by the Indians after the fighting. But it shows what the Spanish weapons would do. Heads, arms, legs, all severed. It shows the Spanish and their Indian allies fighting and destroying the Aztecs. And in the background, Quetzalcoatl has his last moments. The last Aztec emperor was a man by the name of Cuauhtémoc. He was taken alive by the Spanish. And then ceremonially, because it was his fate, they beheaded him. And with his death, the Aztecs disappear from history. Spain built their new colonial capital in Mexico right on Tenochtitlan. They filled in the rest of the lake. They built their new buildings where the great Aztec buildings had stood. The great Aztec temple of Quetzalcoatl was torn down, and the stones of that temple were used to build the great new Mexico City Cathedral, which stands today on the great Central Plaza in Mexico City. And they say, if you go into that cathedral and are allowed to go down into the lowest levels of the cathedral and look at the foundations, you can literally see the foundations resting on the original Maya stones that have never been recarved. The carvings are still there. Quetzalcoatl supports this great Mexico City Cathedral, which is perfectly appropriate because in the long and sometimes very sad and bloody history of man, one God often just steps in and replaces another. It brings me to the end of this story. Our next couple of stories as we approach the Panama Canal will be stories about the Panama Canal. We have a marvelous Panama Canal lecturer on board, Richard Morgan, who will tell you about the Panama Canal in terms of his experience of how it operates, what it looks like today, what the future is like. I will tell you about how it began, starting with the earliest years, starting with the French effort, dealing with Teddy Roosevelt. My next story, which will be the next story I give, I call the pioneers of the Panama Canal, and it brings it up to the French. In a moment, I'll have some time for questions. Let me just point out, all of my stories, the ones I will be telling on this voyage and a lot of others all around the world, are recorded on CDs, they're in albums, and they're available back in Apropos if you're interested. But now it's the time for questions. So anyone with any questions about what we spoke of today, this is the moment. Please, let me know. Sir?
Were the Maya and the Inca aware of one another?
Very good question. Did the Maya and the Inca know of each other? The answer is they probably did, simply because we human beings are more adventuresome and more curious than we're given credit for. We always have some guy that goes off, he has to know what's on the other side of the mountain. But there was no commerce between them. It's quite a long distance from Mexico to the Incas in South America, in primarily Peru and what is today Bolivia. There is Central America. There is a land connection, but there's no way to walk it. There's no way to go overland because the jungles, especially in the southern part of Central America, in southern Panama, are impassable. They're so impassable, by the way, that when we get to Panama, you will see the Pan American Highway, which you have been told perhaps allows you to drive from Alaska to the tip of South America. It doesn't. Because in southern Panama, there's a 40-mile section that has never been built. Because it is so dense. It's the Darien rainforest. It is so dense that even today, no one has tried to build a highway through it. So in order to communicate, they would have had to sail. They didn't have ocean-going ships, but they did have small boats. So it's not inconceivable that somebody may have gotten down to communicate with them. But they were somewhat different people, similar but not the same in their cultures, and for all practical purposes, they were separated. There's another aspect of that, which let me just mention in passing, has to do with the way human beings in general have propagated the world. And it's geographical, and it's the north-south, east-west phenomenon. And what it comes down to is very simply this. If you have a large landmass that extends east to west, like Eurasia, people can move from one place to another place at the same latitude. Because when you're at the same latitude, the climate is essentially the same plants and animals thrive. The way you get your living here, growing these crops and hunting these animals, is going to be very much the same as over here. So you can make this trip back and forth. But when you travel from north to south, you travel through different climates, different ecological systems, and you will find yourself unable to support yourself. If you were to start traveling today, let's say from Louisiana, and you were to walk north, it would take you a while, and you'd walk all the way up to the shore of the Arctic Ocean, you'd find yourself in a place where everything is different, where what skills you knew to live in Louisiana would not keep you alive in far northern Canada. That's the north-south paradox. And to travel from Mexico to Peru also involves this north-south paradox. So it's much more difficult for primitive people to travel north-south than it is for them to travel east-west. So they probably didn't know about each other. I'm sorry. Sir?
Do the genes of the Maya continue with the people of Mexico today?
Did the genes of the Maya? Not only the genes of the Maya, but the Maya. The question is, did Maya genetic material continue to be passed down to the Mexicans of today? And my answer is, not only is the genetic material still there, the people are still there. In southern Mexico and in Guatemala, there are areas, small towns and villages, where the people still speak the old language. They still speak Nahuatl. Not only are they similar, they're the same people. The Maya civilization is long gone. The Aztec civilization is long gone. These are Mexicans. But when you look at them, when you listen to them, when you talk to them, you realize their culture is still Mayan. Their thinking is still Mayan. I knew some young men who trained to be Catholic priests a long, long time ago, and when they were sent to Guatemala to become parish priests, not in the big cities, but in the little towns, in the upcountry, they were warned, you will see a Catholicism there that you do not know. Because those people are Catholic, but they have incorporated Catholicism into the religion they already knew, and they practice it their way. And you will teach it to them their way, because if you try to change it, they'll kill you. Because they know what their Catholicism is, and it is not your Catholicism. It is a mixture of what we have done and what the Maya were doing long before we ever showed up. Another interesting aspect of how people interact. Sir?
Has anybody ever figured out how the Maya and the Inca envisioned this blonde-haired, blue-eyed god?
Very interesting question. How? How did this image of the blonde, blue-eyed god impose itself on the Maya and on the Inca? And we don't know. But there's an interesting little aspect to that, and I just touched upon it. Their legends, the Maya legend said he came out of the sea from the east and later went back into the sea from the east. The Inca don't know about the Atlantic Ocean, but they know about the Pacific. And their god, Contiki Viracocha, appears to them from somewhere to the north, but they don't know where. Is it not possible, given the remarkable curiosity of man and our remarkable enterprise and always wanted to see what's on the other side of whatever is facing us, that somewhere, sometime, a long time ago, somebody wound up crossing the Atlantic and surviving and bringing what he knew to these new people? And in the telling, long afterwards, it all gets changed, but the germ of it remains the same. They could not have invented blonde, blue-eyed, curly-bearded people. They had never seen blonde hair. They didn't know it existed. They had never seen blue eyes. They didn't know they exist. They had never seen beards. They didn't grow beards. They could just as well imagine him as having 4 arms and being blue. No, they describe a person the way we know persons exist, but not there, 6,000 miles away in Europe. Maybe a European showed up. Maybe 2 different Europeans. Maybe 2 different boatloads at 2 different times. But somehow, that image was carried to them. It's as good an explanation as any. And we'll probably never know anything better than that. Anyone else? Ma'am?
I believe you said that the 0 was invented by the man?
Yes.
Correct? What I had always understood was that it was in Arabic.
Long before the Arabs, yes, the Arabs did indeed contrive it for Eurasia. But long before they were calculating with a 0, the Maya were calculating with the 0. The 0, this will be my last question because our time is up. The 0 is a curious phenomenon. What you have to conceive of there is, first of all, the invention of numbers, the invention of mathematics. How do you invent numbers? Well, what does 1 represent? 1 represents a thing. 2 represents 2 of them. And you go on from there. 0 represents nothing. Why do you make a sign of a 0? You don't need the sign of the 0. If there's nothing, there's nothing. But when you calculate in mathematics, you need it. Because otherwise you run into the problem the Romans had, which was you keep adding x's and i's and v's, and you can't divide or multiply with them.
But isn't it also in the abacus? It's a placeholder.
Yes, that's why 0 was invented. 0 was invented as a placeholder. Well, that's a big invention. It's a huge step to take. The Maya took it first. The Arabs, 1,000 years later, during their great blossoming in Baghdad in the 8th, 9th, 10th centuries AD, they invented it independently. But the Maya already knew it.
They said in Israel on the trip that I took about this, that the farmers in a certain area are, in ancient times, put a boulder at the end of the row of planting something.
Well,
And when they wanted to know how many rows they had,
Well, we don't know where the origin of the concept began, and it obviously began independently in more than one place. But the Maya did it first. Without cell phones and the internet, they couldn't tell the Arabs about it, so the Arabs did it independently themselves. We're at the end of our time. The next time I speak, I will tell you the story of the pioneers of the Panama Canal. I hope to see you all then. Thank you all so much for coming today.